started with a prank, a wager, and a fly. Loki sabotaged the forging of Mjolnir by biting the dwarf Brokkr's eyelid mid-craft. The bellows faltered for a single breath, and when Sindri pulled the hammer from the hearth, the handle was a little bit shorter than intended. The gods judged it anyway. Odin, Thor, Freyr, unanimous verdict. The greatest treasure ever forged. The flaw was irrelevant. That detail matters more than it appears. Mjolnir was not a perfect divine instrument handed down from on high. It was the product of interference, imperfection, and dwarven stubbornness. It entered Thor's hands already compromised and became the most important weapon in the Norse cosmos regardless. Two worlds would later take this hammer and rebuild it from the ground up. Marvel made it gleam. God of War made it bleed. Neither kept the short handle. In Norse mythology, no such rule exists. Mjolnir carried no enchantment of worthiness. No god stood over the forge to enchant into it and declare that only who was worthy could lift it. The hammer didn't judge. It didn't test character, measure virtue, or reject the undeserving. It was a tool placed in Thor's hands because Thor was its wielder, not because he earned the right because of some virtue. Marvel built an entirely different mythology around it. Stan Lee, Larry Lieber, and Jack Kirby inscribed the worthiness enchantment into the hammer's very identity. Odin, who had no involvement in Mjolnir's creation whatsoever in the original texts, became its gatekeeper. The hammer transformed from a cosmic tool into a moral test. Whoever holds it, if worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. The God of War took the complete opposite direction. Worthiness never entered the conversation. Mjolnir in that world belongs to a Thor who is violent, broken, and deeply compromised. The hammer doesn't judge him, it simply obeys. 3 versions, 1 hammer. Only one of them invented the actual rule that the other 2 are still debating. The Thrymskvida makes it explicit. When the giant Thrym stole Mjolnir and demanded Freya as his bride, the gods didn't panic merely because they had lost a weapon. Without Mjolnir, they were exposed, and the hammer was more than a weapon. It was linked to protection, blessing, and marriage rites, and in some traditions, to funeral rites as well. Rather than surrender Freya, they accepted Heimdall's plan. Thor would go to Thrym's wedding disguised as the bride. When Thor disguised himself as the bride to retrieve it, the plan depended not simply on deception, but on ritual itself. Seated at the wedding feast, Thor nearly gave himself away, devouring an ox, 8 salmon, and draining caskets of mead until Thrym grew suspicious. Even when the giant recoiled at the fire in the bride's eyes, Loki explained it away. Then came the decisive moment. The hammer was placed in the bride's lap as part of the wedding rite, meant to bless the union, and that was the moment Thor seized it back. The giants handed it over themselves because it belonged in that ceremony. Across Scandinavia, hundreds of small hammer pendants have been recovered from burial sites and settlements. Original people wore Mjolnir around their necks, not as a symbol of war, but as protection, identity, and faith. Many wore it specifically in response to the Christian cross spreading across their lands. Marvel reduced all of that to a weapon with extraordinary combat applications. The God of War went further. Mjolnir in that world exists almost exclusively to cause destruction. The religious dimension didn't survive either adaptation. What began as a symbol of cosmic order became, in both retellings, primarily something that hits really hard. The Prose Edda is specific about this. Thor couldn't freely wield Mjolnir with bare hands. He required Jarngripr, iron gloves, to grip the handle, and Megingjord, a belt of strength, to channel the power needed to throw it. Without both, the hammer was beyond even his capability to wield properly. The 3 items together functioned as a system. Mjolnir alone wasn't very useful. In the old stories, this wasn't theory. Thor crossed into giant lands carrying all 3. Belt tightened, strength doubled, iron gloves gripping the shortened handle. Then the hammer moved. One blow shattered the stone, another dropped a giant where he stood. This was not a lone god relying on one miracle weapon. It was equipment, strategy, force, and timing working as one. This isn't a minor detail. It fundamentally repositions where Thor's power actually lives. It doesn't live in the hammer, it lives in the combination of the god, his tools, and his role as protector. Remove any one element and the system fails. Marvel collapsed all of that into one object. The hammer became the source. Thor without Mjolnir became diminished Thor, a recurring plot device built entirely on an inversion of the original mythology. God of War gives Thor no such dependency. He wields it with raw physicality, no equipment, and no ritual requirement. The belt and gloves vanish entirely. Both adaptations told a simpler story, a god and his hammer. The myth told a more interesting and representative one, a god, his tools, the symbolisms, and the understood limits of even divine power. This is the one detail all three versions agreed on. The prose Edda records it in Skaldskaparmál. After being thrown, Mjolnir returns to Thor's hand. No explanation is offered for the mechanism, it simply does that, as naturally as lightning follows thunder. The returning hammer was not a spectacle in Norse myth, it was a functional property of the weapon, stated plainly and moved on from quickly. Marvel kept this feature. The visual became one of cinema's most recognizable moments, the hammer lifting off the ground, cutting through the air, and snapping back into an outstretched hand. What the myth mentioned in a single line, Marvel turned into the identity itself. God of War kept this feature too. Thor catches it mid-battle after hurling it through enemies. The return mechanic becomes a core combat feature, satisfying, visceral, and deliberately engineered to feel powerful. But the agreement ends there. In myth, the return served a practical purpose. Thor needed it back to keep fighting giants and maintaining cosmic order. In Marvel, it became a spectacle. In God of War, it became gameplay. Same property, three completely different reasons for keeping it. This is the only detail that survived every retelling intact, and even then, none of them kept it for the same reason. Maybe the same reason they all kept it was that it was interesting. Mjolnir existed for one primary purpose in Norse mythology. Not glory, not heroism, order against chaos. The Rime giants, the Jotnar, were not simply enemies, they represented the forces that perpetually threatened cosmic stability. Thor patrolled the boundaries of the known world and drove these forces back. Mjolnir was the instrument of that patrol. Every giant killed was the world surviving another day. In the myths, that struggle was constant and unglamorous. Thor crossed into giant territory again and again, hammer in hand, belt tightened, giants driven back to the edges. Every victory was temporary. Chaos was never eliminated, only delayed. The fighting mattered precisely because it could never end. The Voluspa makes the cost explicit. At Ragnarok, Thor faces Jormungandr, the world serpent. He kills it. He walks 9 steps, then he falls, destroyed by the venom of the creature he just defeated. Mjolnir does not save him in the end. Victory and death arrive together. The hammer that holds chaos back could never hold it back forever. Marvel reframed that entirely. Mjolnir became the weapon of a hero's journey, triumphant, redemptive, ultimately optimistic. The chaos Thor fights is defeated. The story ends with him standing. God of War lands closer to the myth's darkness, but for different reasons. It's that Thor is already consumed by the chaos inside him. Mjolnir in his hands doesn't hold back disorder, it produces it. The myth gave the world a hammer that fought chaos and lost honorably. Both adaptations flinched at that ending. If you enjoyed this myth, like and subscribe, and check out the next story on screen. It's just as unbelievable and just as fun. Check it out.